Welcome to Single Malt History with Gareth Russell, pouring out your serving of pure, distilled, intoxicating, and occasionally delicious history. Hello and welcome to the Season 3 premiere, very grand, episode of Single Malt History with Gareth Russell. I'm the eponymous Gareth, as opposed to the Single Malt, and it's a pleasure to be back a full 4.5 weeks later than planned, due largely in part to my laptop deciding to behave as if it was demoniacally possessed and having to be shipped off for lengthy repairs, during which, despite my Luddite soul, I wandered around bereft, bewailing and befuddled. Just as the laptop was resurrected like righteous Lazarus of Bethany, COVID-19, with hatefully flamboyant timing, decided to torpedo me with a nice dose of a cough reminiscent of a tubercular 19th century countess, a total lack of a sense of smell, and a brain fog during which I proclaimed, I really need to be able to figure out what jobs go where because jobs are pretty important to my words. So that went well. All things considered, I know I'm very lucky, and so it's with tongue firmly in cheek that I say all this and cheerfully acknowledge with gratitude that my ability to speak and my sense of smell is back, although it's been less firmly restored. So far, it's a bit like the French monarchy in 1814. It's back, it's not strong, and that kind of dad joke come historical niche humour is part of the joy you can expect in Season 3 of this podcast. Anyway, it is on to a different saga as we begin our third season, and with, as ever, deep thanks to you, our listeners. Our guest today is American author Don Hollway, who stopped by to discuss his new book, The Last Viking. More on that in a moment. But before we get to the capering, blood-soaked mayhem of the 11th century, a recap for your sins on what I've been up to and, more importantly, what I've been reading since we parted company at the end of Season 2. What to expect from Season 3 will also be discussed before we spectrally or cyberly meet Don, and I'll also be discussing some information on a giveaway for listeners over on Instagram, so stay tuned for that. Back in May, which seems, this might just be me, but it seems much longer ago now than it actually was, I was the historian in residence or on tour, whichever nomenclature is more precise, for British History Tour's Anne Boleyn Tour. Led by Philippa Brule, it was a 1-week trip, staying at Anne Boleyn's childhood home of Hever Castle in the southeastern English county of Kent, with day trips to Hampton Court Palace and the Tower of London, the latter of which coincided with the anniversary of Boleyn's execution on May 19th. There is an episode, I believe, in one of our earlier seasons, I'm trying to remember, would it be Season 1? Yes, Season 1, on the execution of Anne Boleyn, so I can recommend that if you want to go back and listen to the events of that day. During the tour, I gave a talk to guests on the Boleyn's family politics, and we were joined on various evenings by two brilliant historians, Jonathan Foyle, who discussed 16th century palace life, and Tracy Borman, who chatted about how Anne Boleyn was influenced by the Queen's consort of England, who had gone before her. I'm back on the road in July with Philippa for a tour on Anne Boleyn's daughter, Elizabeth I, and delighted to announce here I'll be working with British History Tours again in May and the summer of 2023, DV. All the information is on their website. Had this podcast been up on schedule and had my laptop not required the diocesan exorcist, I would have been hoping to do an episode on Her Majesty the Queen's Platinum Jubilee and a retrospective on the history of the monarchy and the longest reign of a sovereign in British history. Alas, that was not to be. Some of you, of our American listeners, may have seen me on Fox and Friends when I was invited to do some historical commentary for the American morning shows about the monarchy, and particularly about what Elizabeth II learned from the earlier stages of her reign and from her parents. I also participated in an online debate with Claire Ridgway and Dr. Owen Emerson, Assistant Curator at Hever, about where the evidence leads us in regards the year of Anne Boleyn's birth. Documentation is missing, with dates once ranging on an incredible 13-year spectrum from 1499 to 1512, making Henry VIII's second wife anything from 37 to 24 at the time she was beheaded. Today, the main dates are either 1501 or 1507. I lean towards the later end of that spectrum, Claire and Owen towards the earlier. It was a great, respectful date, which I thoroughly enjoyed participating in. I'm very excited to say that actually I'm going to be, for the first time in a couple of years, producing a paper online for Tudor history, and I will be focusing specifically on the academic debate around her date of birth and putting forward what I believe the evidence leads us towards. That will be out at the end of the summer. Since we parted, I've had, I think, 2 reviews out. One in the Times on Professor Terence Dooley's new book, Burning the Big House, the story of the Irish country house in a time of war and revolution, published by Yale University Press and written by a leading expert on the Irish political revolution of 1916 to 1923, as well as being an expert on the decline of the Irish aristocracy from the 1870s to the 1920s. Burning the Big House is a short but very engaging, expertly crafted analysis of why some aristocratic houses were burned during Ireland's 2 internal wars in the early 1920s, but also why so many were spared. My review is available to subscribers of The Times, but I think it's being syndicated, so I will confirm that if, as, or when. Dr. Dooley's other books for fans of Irish history include the groundbreaking academic monograph, The Plight of the Monaghan Protestants, 1912 to 1926, and he was on the committee to commemorate the 2016 centenary of Irish republicanism's Easter Rising. It was aristocrats and Irish history again for me, with the review 2 weekends ago in The Telegraph, when I reviewed Sean O'Driscoll's brilliant biography of the debutante who quit high society life to join the IRA during the Northern Irish troubles of the 1970s. Heiress, rebel, vigilante, bomber, The Extraordinary Life of Rose Dugdale is a really interesting reflection on the price paid by political fundamentalism and for political fundamentalism, as well as being a very good narrative of one of the greatest art heists of the 20th century. O'Driscoll depicts Dugdale's sincerity, but also her brutality. I came away from this book convinced of both and utterly chilled by the latter, which seems to me fueled by Dugdale's certainty that she is absolutely correct in every single thing she believes and has done. My review is available to subscribers of the Daily Telegraph, and Sean O'Driscoll's book is out now. Privately or in a personal capacity, I've been reading a couple of books which, unfortunately, I personally did not enjoy as much as I did Burning the Big House and Heiress, Rebel, Vigilante, Bomber. Although I really have to stress, by way of a preamble, that this remains predominantly a personal choice, one of personal taste, and in at least one case, it's more that I enjoyed the book a little less as a reader than I perhaps did as a professional. I don't know if that entirely makes sense or holds water logically. The major one I'm thinking of in my mind is Frances Dimond's new biography, Queen Alexandra, Loyalty and Love. This biography of our current queens, or actually I don't know where you're listening from or what your national identity or political views are. So my current queen's great-grandmother, Alexandra of Denmark, was honestly perhaps the book in 2022 to which I was looking forward the most. Written by Frances Dimond, as mentioned, and it's been so long, decades, since we have had a full-length biography of the Danish princess who married Queen Victoria's eldest son in 1863 and who then became Britain's queen consort during her husband's short reign from 1901 to 1910. I had promised to review it via my Facebook page and Instagram, so thus here we are. So what I will, and generally speaking, unless it's for a newspaper or for a magazine or a periodical, I tend not to do negative reviews. If I don't like the book on a personal level, I tend not to post public reviews of it. I'm very aware, unless the book is seriously and damagingly misleading, and even then I won't unless I'm asked. It's a very tough industry. I think most authors are trying their best. They put a lot into it. And ultimately, if a book just isn't to my personal taste, I don't feel the need to stand in a quasi-professional soapbox and critique it or attack it, largely because I think if you are a historian or an author, it isn't simply a personal review anymore. It becomes, as I say, quasi-professional. But I did promise to review this one, and I have to say the criticisms I have of it don't completely outweigh the positives. And as I say, it's a book I said I would review for this podcast. And what I will say is that Queen Alexandra as a biography is such a testament to research. It really is extraordinarily well researched and detailed. Unfortunately for me, it feels like more of a wonderful book for research, less like one to read for pleasure. And what I mean by that is that even the most well-informed royal expert might struggle with some of its early chapters in particular, in which dozens upon dozens of Princess Alexandra's relatives are introduced within sentences of one another. I understand that that is sometimes unavoidable, but the problem really arises, or at least is augmented by the fact that these individuals are referred to interchangeably with almost no internal signposting by either sort of the minutiae of etiquette for their official titles and names, or by their first names, or by their family nicknames. So I personally really don't mind lots of details on other people in biographies. I personally prefer it as writer and reader. No one is an island. Context adds flavour. And in Queen Alexandra, it's especially interesting to see just how many people were involved in arranging royal betrothals and marriages well into the 19th century. However, with the dozens introduced at once, coupled with the inconsistent way they're named and referred to, the chapter surrounding Alexandra's engagement was particularly dense. Then courtiers are added in, again frequently with almost no explanatory and text information about who they were or what they did. So my gut is that without an extremely detailed prior knowledge of 19th century Central and Northern European royalty, this book could at times be a tough read. In terms of its arguments, most of them are, I found, convincing. There's an interesting rehabilitation in this book of Alexandra's husband, King Edward VII. He gave his name to the Edwardian era. And while he's often admired today for his diplomatic skills when it came to foreign policy, and also his political savvy with the liberal crisis towards the end of his reign, in terms of personal biography, Edward VII is regularly presented as a self-indulgent hedonist who habitually cheated on his lovely and loving Danish wife. Francis Diamond persuasively argues that Edward VII was a more sympathetic character than usually assumed, but the rehabilitation is nonetheless sometimes taken a little too far. For instance, the book argues that aged 19, future Edward VII didn't tell his father that he had lost his virginity to an Irish actress because he was so chivalrous that he didn't want to besmirch the lady's name by discussing their tryst. However, he did discuss it at length with fellow officers in the army, so surely the more likely logical explanation is that Edward felt no urge to tell his father about the details of his sex life, especially since his father, Prince Albert, was obsessively controlling of his eldest son and had very firm moral standards and views on sex outside of marriage. So I would say Edward VII benefits from Dimon's sympathetic reevaluation, but he may not always have been so thoroughly on the side of the angels. So while the book is at times a little heavy-going, there is, and I cannot stress this enough, there is no denying the depth of Dimon's devotion to reconstructing Queen Alexandra's life. Dimon's archival expertise is astonishing, and she deals particularly well with the potential problem posed to a biographer by the lack of Queen Alexandra's private papers, many of which were incinerated by the privacy prioritising Queen shortly before her death. As a thorough and precise biography of Queen Alexandra, it is hard to imagine how this book will ever be bettered. If at times, especially earlier, it wasn't always to my personal tastes as a reader, if you are a royal expert and if you are someone particularly well versed and interested in Victorian and Edwardian royalty, this book is an absolute must. And I have to say, I mean, I've said it 3 times and I'll say it for a 4th, the research is extraordinary. Currently, I'm reading The Last Emperor of Mexico by Edward Shawcross and Elizabeth Fremantle's The Poison Bed, a novel inspired by the mysterious death in custody of English diplomat Sir Thomas Overbury in 1613. I'm very nearly finished an advanced reader's copy of Catherine Chen's new novel based on the life of St. Joan of Arc, and last night, heart filled with warmth, to be totally honest, I finished Alice Oseman's novella Nick and Charlie, the last in reading order of the Heartstopper series. More on all of those at another time. And the books I'm currently reviewing, which obviously I can't say too much about until they're out, more anon, etc. Since we last chatted, I've also been picking out illustrations for my forthcoming biography of the late Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. 2022 is the 20th anniversary of the Queen Mother's death, and what better time to have been able to sit down with some of those who knew her to collect their anecdotes and memories for posterity. The result is Do Let's Have Another Drink, 101 anecdotes from the Queen Mother's life, beginning in 1900 through to her death in 2002. Some of these have never been published before. I'm really excited about that. A lot of them are very funny, credit to my sources on that one. And I've also tried to present the truth, not always pleasant, about Elizabeth's relationships with her niece Nerissa, her sister-in-law Wallis, and her granddaughter-in-law Diana, Princess of Wales. And I can announce that we have our first strapline, or quote, endorsement, whatever you want to call it, for the book from Emerald Fennell, who won the Oscar for Best Original Screenplay for her movie Promising Young Woman. Emerald also played Camilla Parker Bowles in 2 seasons of The Crown and Nurse Patsy in 4 seasons of Call the Midwife. Emerald received an early advanced copy of Do Let's Have Another Drink, and she's described it as utterly glorious. Do Let's Have Another Drink is already available for Utterly Glorious pre-ordering. How's that for a shameless plug? Via my Instagram page _Gareth Russell, all one word, all lowercase, 2 S's, 2 L's, as well as through Amazon, Barnes & Noble's, independent bookstores like Northshire, and its publishers Simon & Schuster in America and Canada. For British and Irish readers, try HarperCollins, the publisher's page there, Amazon, Eason's, Waterstones, all good bookstores. The book is also available in Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. And now over to our guest in an interview which was recorded several weeks ago. Our guest today is Don Hollway, who joins us from Pennsylvania. Don is an author, illustrator, and historian. He is also a classic rapier fencer and historical reenactor. His writing on aviation, history, and reenacting have appeared in magazines ranging from Aviation History, History Magazine, Military Heritage, Military History, Wild West, and World War II, to Muzzleloader, Renaissance Magazine, and Scientific American. He lives in Pennsylvania, USA, and is available for interview if any other podcasters hear this and would like to talk to him about his acclaimed biography, which is the topic of our interview of King Harald the Third of Norway, the Last Viking. The Washington Post said of the Last Viking, if you loved Robert Graves' intrigue-suffused I, Claudius, or heroic fantasy in the mold of Robert E. Howard, George R. R. Martin, and Howard Andrew Jones, you owe it to yourself to pick it up. The Last Viking is exciting. It's that good. The Times praised it as a saga of sex, pillage, and gore, and Country Life praised it with the warning that it's not for the faint-hearted. So who was Harald the Third? Well, for anyone who shared my history lessons at Down High Grammar School in Northern Ireland, aged 11, we would have been hearing of him as King Harald Hardrada, the Scandinavian sovereign who was the first of the four aspiring kings of England to bite the dust in the tumultuous year of 1066. But to get to the end, you need the beginning. And Harald Sigurdsson burst into history as a teenaged youth in a Viking battle from which he escaped with little more than his life and a thirst for vengeance. But from these humble origins, he became one of Norway's most legendary kings. The Last Viking is a fast-moving story of Harald's life as he journeyed across the medieval world as far as Constantinople and the Holy Land. In these early years, he fought both for and against Christian, Muslim, and pagan rulers until his eventual return home to claim his love, his crown, and his destiny as King of Norway. But restless still, Harald sought to expand his kingdom into an empire and fought to seize both the Danish and English crowns. Ultimately unsuccessful, he died sword in hand in battle against the king of the Anglo-Saxons, and his death would mark the end of the Viking Age. Combining Norse sagas, Byzantine accounts, Anglo-Saxon chronicles, and even King Harald's own verse and prose into a single compelling story. Don Hollway, thank you so much for joining us in Single Malt History to discuss The Last Viking.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's
9:30 a.m. here, a little early for me to start in on the single malt. Is that okay?
It's absolutely understandable. That's why I schedule all my afternoons, all my interviews for the afternoon, Don. So, well, first and foremost, and I know it's a touch obvious, it's a question, but what was it that attracted you to telling Harald's story?
I first read Harold's story as a boy, and it was like, wow, what a life. But, it was just the briefest of accounts. He was a real life fantasy hero. I mean, he fought all over the medieval world. He romanced an empress. He married a princess, made a fortune, wrote poetry, and he died like a Viking. I mean, I always wanted to tell his story, but a magazine article wouldn't do him any justice and wouldn't be long enough to go into it. But then my agent called and said, hey, Vikings are hot right now because of the TV show. Got any ideas? And I said, let me tell you a story. And went on from there.
Well, you dedicate the book to King Harald's memory. What did you find that made you admire him?
I dedicated the book to him because, well, he should be remembered. I mean, he changed history, but those who do remember him like you do, only because of the battles at Stamford Bridge and Hastings, his effect on English history. But really, that was only the last chapter of his life. At age 15, he was an outlaw and an exile. I mean, his father and his mother and his brother were all dead. He escaped from his homeland, traveled to faraway lands, and rose mostly on the strength of his charisma and his sword arm. I mean, I admire him for taking what he was given and making the most of it. That said, there were many people to whom he became a figure of terror. I mean, he was admirable in his youth, but probably not so much as a king. He didn't get the nickname Hard Ruler for nothing.
Well, Harold's life in many, I mean, you sort of alluded to that perfectly, because Harold's life in many ways sprang from a culture in which beauty and violence seem intertwined. I wanted to quote from a poem about battle which Harold himself allegedly wrote, and which you quote in The Last Viking. I will dare to defend my place in battle according to my mother's wish. Let us redden our shield rims in rage. This young skald will stand. Battle maddened before spears and the swing of swords, men harden themselves in war. And you received, Don, a lot of praise from the reviews I've read and from myself after reading the book for how well and accurately and vividly you describe the experience of Warcraft in Harold's lifetime. Did your experiences as a reenactor, I have to assume that your experiences as a reenactor helped, and what was the Viking perception of Warcraft? Do you think it's being misrepresented?
I like your expression about the beauty and violence intertwined. I think that's the essence of The Last Viking. That poetic quote was by Harold as a boy just before his first big fight, the Battle of Sticklestad in Norway in AD 1030, where his older brother was killed and Harold barely escaped with his life. Sticklestad was notable because it was fought partially under a total solar eclipse, which you can imagine everyone present, pagan and Christian alike, took that as an omen, the eye of God or Odin looking down on them. As far as my reenacting, I'm primarily not a Viking reenactor, I have to admit that, but 17th century English Civil War, 30 Years War, when gunpowder was just beginning to take over the battlefield. I've always found the 17th century to be fascinating. It's like the bridge between the medieval and the modern ages. And
absolutely.
It was one of history's most violent but most beautiful eras. I mean, in the 30 Years War, some parts of Germany lost half their population, but it was the Baroque era. I mean, it was the era of Versailles when everything was, gilded cherubs and sculpted marble. I mean, there was beauty and violence at the same time. As a reenactor, I play a pikeman, which is one of the last pre-gunpowder soldiers. A pike is basically a two-handed spear that you don't throw. You use it to hold off enemy cavalry and such. My unit, the Twisted Knot Company of Pike and Shot, shout out to them. They play everything. We play everything from Elizabethan times to the English Civil War. There's an English reenactor unit called the Sealed Knot. We're like them, but we're twisted. We demonstrate period artillery at the Pennsylvania Renaissance Fair with a period correct cannon. So I've taken cannon firing off of my bucket list. You can pretend, you can say that reenacting is all pretend, but we're all history nerds. I mean, we do the research and we challenge each other all the time for accuracy. I've slept on cold ground and gotten drunk with my friends around campfires. And a lot of that went into the book. I mean, The Last Viking wasn't written behind a desk.
Yeah.
That said, I'm less well versed in Viking reenacting. I've been to a couple Viking events, to help sell the book to Viking reenactors. And I went in my new Viking garb and my shiny new Viking weaponry. And one of my fellow reenactors said, "You look like you're from Viking corporate headquarters." So I clearly got to work on that impression a little bit. But I've been a classical fencer for years. That's as opposed to modern Olympic style fencing. So I know how the various medieval weapons were used. A pike block that I reenact is a spear square. It's an ancient formation that goes in and out of history for thousands of years. People learned to defeat it. It was, it was discarded, and then hundreds of years later, it was revived. I mean, you see it in the phalanxes of Alexander the Great and the schiltrons of the medieval Scots. Wellington's battle squares at Waterloo, although those were bayonets, it was the same principle. And also the shield wall of the Vikings. So I used what I learned of the mechanics of pre-gunpowder combat to write The Last Viking. The vividness that you say, I thank you for that. I guess that's the writer in me trying to put myself in that scene and bring the reader in with me, kind of like describing the movie in my head. And regarding the Viking view of Warcraft, I think it differs from the modern view. The goal for modern soldiers is, like General Patton said, not to die for your country, but to make the other guy die for his country. But the Vikings believed their time of death was predetermined. If it was not your day to die, you couldn't be killed. So fight. If it was your day to die, then you couldn't avoid death. So fight. Viking berserkers are assumed to have been high on drugs because, modern people can't understand that mindset of theirs. I think they simply disregarded the threat of death. They knew they had to die eventually. The goal was to die gloriously, to die a worthwhile death. And I wonder how much of that was responsible for the way they terrorized Europe for hundreds of years, because the people going against them did not feel that way.
Well, I mean, I think you're absolutely, that was one thing that came across so well and interestingly in the books, which was, and it's such an interesting problem and potentially rewarding challenge with history, which is trying to explain that there can be a completely different mentality, often a vast gulf in mentalities between the reader and the subject. And that with the Vikings of the predestination element, I suppose that might be a underlying Christian term, but that sort of idea of that destiny has already been written. And one dynamic I was also fascinated by was the skalds, which in my ignorance I'd never heard of. Can you describe to our listeners what that is?
A skald was a Viking poet, but also a chronicler or a writer of the old sagas. Few people in that day and age could read and write. The Viking skalds were like the Greek Homers or the Roman Virgils of their day. Harald was a big fan of poetry, and dabbled in it himself. He cultivated a set of skalds who worked in his court, whose work survives to this day, probably solely because of him. I don't flatter myself that I could be much of a Viking warrior, but I aspired to be the last and best of Harald's skalds. Not a poet, but a chronicler who could make the reader feel his story. And I hope nobody ever tells it better.
Well, I mean, it felt like a saga. I mean, I'm sort of stepping on, I think, the Times review, but it did feel like a saga. That was the tone. I thought it was. It had us. I mean, I suppose that's an interesting, again, just talking of the gulf of mentalities. But I suppose for me, there was almost a cinematic quality, if that makes sense, to the Last Viking, because it felt historical, but it also felt like it had the arc of a saga or a film or something, whatever the modern equivalent is. It was I certainly thought, my goodness, we had these very brief lessons. I mean, we were 11, to give credit to the history department, on 1066. Mm-hmm. And Harold was, as she said, he was the one that you got rid of Edward the Confessor first in the first week, and then then you did Stamford Bridge. And Harold was also, the other thing that lifted out from the Last Viking was, as we've touched on, that your king was a remarkably well-traveled man. The section both on his very adventurous love life and his role at the heart of Byzantine imperial politics blew my mind. And I haven't actually finished the third one yet, but two of my favorite historical works that I think also sort of attempted to be almost like a modern chronicle were John Julius Norwich's books on Byzantium. I think anything to do with the Byzantine Empire fascinates me. So when he turned up in Byzantium, I was delighted and very surprised. Was there a particular aspect of his life, Don, that you especially loved researching? And sort of a second part to that question, what do you think these lesser known aspects of Harold's private and political life show us about him?
I as well found his years in Byzantium to be just fascinating. I'm like you. I really knew little about that time and place before researching the book. I mean, I knew he was there, but I didn't know the intricacies and intrigues that were going on. Constantly. Right. There are two different viewpoints about Harold's time there. The Byzantines looked down on him, or looked down on anyone who wasn't Byzantine.
Yeah.
So they were like a lower order of life as far as they were concerned. So Harold is mentioned in Byzantine accounts of the time, but to believe them, he was just a foreign mercenary and he was hardly worth mention. So he's there, but you don't get him played up as much in the Byzantine accounts. Now, to believe the Viking skalds who heard the story from Harold and his men, Harold was, as I have him in the book, one step away from the throne. And I think there's a certain amount of Viking BS in there, but the Byzantines accounts do back up the story enough that Harold's viewpoint is credible. What I did with The Last Viking was, first of all, take in all those accounts. And, most of the saga writers would describe something in one sentence. He was there at this time and he did this. I tried to describe what that was like to be there and bring the reader in and let them try to experience as much as I can. I mean, after 1,000 years, who can say what the truth was back then?
Yeah.
I'll be the first one to admit that. I mean, you have these accounts that say he was there and he did this, but you have to take it all with a certain amount of a certain grain of salt. I point out where the accounts conflict, and I admit when I speculate. And I flatter myself. If you read the reviews, I think I told the story well.
Oh, you did. And to be completely honest, I wouldn't be saying otherwise, considering I'm interviewing you. But I wouldn't be saying to the contrary of otherwise. I wouldn't be saying yes, you did if you didn't. I thought it was absolutely brilliant. It was.
Thank you.
It's always when I got the copy of the book, love the title, but it's always a bit nerve-wracking when you start a new book, because you think, I really hope I enjoy this, particularly if it's for work, and it was excellently done. Can you tell us what you're working on next, and where we can find you, where our listeners can find you online?
Much of my magazine work is free online. The copyrights have reverted to me, so I posted it on my website at donhollway.com. That's Hollway, Hollway, not Holloway. Everybody misspells my last name. It's an Anglo-Saxon name. We looked up our family tree online and found in the 1870s where our ancestors were Holloways when they got on the boat in Bath. Sorry, I think they pronounce that Bath over there. But they were Holloways when they got on the boat, and they were Hallways when they got off the boat.
Well, you know that when we were sort of setting up this interview, I had to be really vigilant with my emails, because autocorrect just did not believe that Hollway was a name. I thought, this is going to change it to like Hallow. I mean, constantly. And I think it did it once when we were sort of like 3 or 4 emails in, which just would have made me look incredibly rude. But yeah, Hollway, H-O-L-L.
I'm so used to it at this point. I don't even correct anybody anymore.
My surname's Russell, and I have said it's been sort of one of those habits that you pick up from my mother, who anytime she made a reservation, I would have heard her as a child say, Russell's 2 S's, 2 L's. And I have never encountered someone who spells it with 1 L. And yet, the minute I stopped that sort of litany of correction, my name lost an L around nearly everyone I knew. I do sometimes get sometimes from colleagues who I've known for years, dear Russell, and I'm like, I don't think you're addressing me with my surname. I think you've just gotten confused. I think this is my first name. But yes, Hollway.
Yeah, we both have the same experience.
Yeah.
And so donhollway.com, and actually my next book, At the Gates of Rome, about the fall of the Eternal City in AD 410, is coming out in a few weeks, early May. So if you go to my website, there are free sample chapters and links. Actually, it has its own website, gatesofrome.com. So there's free chapters for anybody who's interested.
Well, this will actually be, we're recording this just for listeners, early April. It will be going out 5th May. So I think people should be able to pre-order or order that it should be pretty close to release date, I think, by the time this goes out. What a topic. That must have been absolutely fascinating to write about as well.
It's a different kind of book than The Last Viking, because it's a lot bigger cast of characters. It's basically the story of the one of the last great Roman generals, and Alaric, who was the king of the Goths, who finally took down Rome in 410 AD. So all the people that they know and their interactions, I just thought their story was pretty fascinating, how they started out as enemies and sort of were forced to become friends. And then, of course, one of them was killed and the other one took vengeance. And it's a pretty epic story.
Specifically for this interview, I can say to my listeners, if you're interested in Scandinavian history, medieval history, or the Vikings at all, The Last Viking by Don Hollway is an absolute must-read. And Don, thank you so much for stopping by and giving us your time for the interview today. I appreciate it.
Not a problem. Glad to be here. Thank you.